April 20th, 2011 was a day that was a big and unforgettable nightmare for Sony. To the disbelief of the gaming company, Sony released the data of 177 million PlayStation users into the hands of hackers. In addition to its own loss of $171 million, the company's online gaming service, the PlayStation Network, was also unavailable for 23 days, and in a way, Sony was devastated. But what actually happened? And what team was behind this incident? Why didn't Sony say anything about the hack for a week or inform its users? Sony is undoubtedly one of the biggest companies in the video game world. When it comes to game consoles, I must say that Sony is one of the kings of the catsuit world, and games like God of War and Last FS have won the hearts of gamers. However, there have been many dark events in Sony's history. And Sony has always tried to make sure that its users don't see these events, or even if they do, they forget about them. One of these events was the 23-day PlayStation Network hack that Sony didn't want its fans and users to know about. To learn about this incident, we have to go back to April 2011. When several cool and popular games like Mortal Kombat Portal 2, Driver San Francisco, and Sock'em 4 were supposed to be released and make the gaming market really hot. A world that was still young and new after 5 years of its public release, and not everyone could play online at that time. And the internet speed for home users was about 128 kbps, and more than that required a license, and those users who had access to high-speed internet were very few. But surprisingly, on April 20th, the PSN servers crashed and users started sending emails to Sony support without knowing where the problem was. Because they thought the problem was Sony's own and their internet was having problems, but it didn't take long for users to realize that the problem was global and Sony's silence was only making things worse. A user who introduced himself as one of the moderators of the PSXSend site posted on Reddit and said that the main reason for this was the release of a custom firmware called Rival, which would have effectively turned the console into a developer's console, and this could have caused a lot of problems, and this was not good at all. The user also mentioned in his post that you could connect to the private PSN network that Sony had created for developers through the same custom firmware that it provides and steal network information through fake credit cards. So why didn't Sony check the banking information? Because that network was secure and he expected everyone on it to be a real and honest developer. In fact, that user said that the February release was the main reason for the PSN network being dumped and that Sony was fixing the problems. Many even said that the problem could be from the update, or maybe the problem was from somewhere else, and all this was because Sony had been silent until that moment and had not said anything. But finally, Sony's silence was broken, and Sony's European branch said that they were investigating the problems and that there was no need to worry at all, but that post was deleted very quickly and no one heard from it. Then its North American branch came and made another post and said that the services would be online in the next day or two, but again it did not say where the problem came from. But that small post from its European branch was enough for everyone to suspect the anonymous hacking group and the hacking incident. Because Anonymous was already in trouble before these stories because of the legal battle he had with George Hatz. But who was George Hatz? George Hatz was the one who had actually jailbroken the PlayStation and released a master key that could recognize any program on the console as an officially approved program, which put pressure on Sony. Then Sony took George to court and eventually blocked Linux support on the PlayStation with a software update in March 2010 so that users could no longer do strange things on the console. And so, this issue put pressure on Melto, and the hacker group Anonymous, which always takes the phase of supporting the people, got to work and entered the company's servers through Sony's music service called Sony Entertainment Network. At first, some security officials noticed a breach, but since they didn't see anything special, they ignored it and wrote a small report and said it was a breach, but since they didn't do anything, we fixed the problem. Unaware that this breach would become the biggest hack in video game history. In short, after a week, Sony finally came and said that our servers had been hacked and our information had been stolen. And in fact, 77 million PSN users had their information leaked, and that wasn't just any leak. As Sony had said in a post, information like name, email address, date of birth, gender, contact number, password, lawyers, everything. Even the bank information of 11,000 people in Germany, Australia, Spain, the Netherlands, and other countries was stolen. This bank information included the account number, username, and address of the other party. And I must say that the entire biography of the user was stolen, and it was easy to commit fraud with this general information. Now the strange thing about the story was that Sony could not give an exact time at all for its server to be online. And hey, today and tomorrow, it finally became a full 23 days. And after these 23 days, its server gradually became accessible in different parts of the world and people were able to play their games. But Sony was embarrassed by this because first of all, it had kept a secret and had not informed the people at the beginning, so you could say that it was afraid of its shame. And well, this had caused it to remain silent and hide something. And then it had practically messed up the story management and people wanted to play the game but they couldn't. It so happened that Sony had 3 senior executives come to a press conference and bow down and apologize. After that, Sony gave PlayStation users a package called Welcome Back, which included a few games and a few other gifts as an apology. He wanted to win people's hearts and not let people get upset with Sony, even though he lost many of his users. Almost 4 days after Sony returned, he completely removed the option to reset the password of PlayStation accounts. The reason was very funny because you could go and reset a user's date of birth, address, email, and password very easily and without their approval, and well, that was kind of funny. In short, Sony came after all these stories and said that putting this mess together cost us $171 million. But on the other hand, government officials didn't leave Sony alone, and Sony was especially sued, especially in the US and Canada, and they told Sony that when you're storing all this information on your servers, you should encrypt it completely. You can't just do it without a password. But we all know that two-step verification prevents these hacks to some extent, but this did not apply to Sony because it took 5 years to make it mandatory and to come to the conclusion that it should be mandatory. It was as if they knew nothing about hacking and security. A few years later, Sony's film production department was hacked and all the information was leaked. In general, Sony is not very reliable in this area, but other companies have learned a good lesson from these stories to better protect their servers and not have such a Sony-like disaster happen to them again. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end of this video. If you like this style of video, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and share it with your friends.